Last week, we heard from Michael Castor, head of the Global China program at Article 19, who unpacked how Taiwan's rights-based cybersecurity governance stands in sharp contrast to China's expanding digital authoritarian model. Michael walked us through China's legal architecture, from its cybersecurity law to the growing power of the Cyberspace Administration of China, or CAC, and how these institutions are being exported across the Indo-Pacific.
What we've seen is that the Cyberspace Administration of China has risen from, this sort of small fringe internet regulatory body to a supra-regulatory institution under the party itself, which gives it incredible reach and incredible influence.
We also discussed how Beijing's approach is not just about controlling information, but about shaping the global narrative on digital governance. If you missed it, it's definitely worth going back to hear how data localization, real name registration, and the legal groundwork for internet shutdowns are being normalized under the guise of national security. Today we pick up where we left off, examining what these digital norms with Chinese characteristics look like in practice, and how countries in the region are responding. You're listening to The Divide. I'm Iris Xu.
We settled on like a three-part sort of typology of norms. So the first being cyber sovereignty, the second being multilateralism, and the third being the securitization of digital development. So the first norm on cyber sovereignty, of course, this goes back a decade and a half to the 2010 white paper on the internet in China, which really first laid out some of the thinking behind cyber sovereignty. Simply put, it puts forward an argument that as a sovereign, political entity, a state has the right to develop and impose laws affecting the internet in the same way that it can claim the sovereign right to pass laws in other domains. And of course, this is problematic from the perspective of the universality of human rights, because it claims that a state can impose laws that, of course, don't adhere to, say, international human rights law protections on freedom of expression or right to privacy. And obviously, this argument breaks down when we talk about arguments that say sovereignty justify laws that permit torture or other things that are criminalized under international law. And it's the same with looking at justification for domestic legislation around digital governance. Also, it needs to adhere to international and universal human rights principles, but also because of the interconnectivity of the internet, laws that restrict flow of certain information and otherwise, as states adhere to or try to adhere to this sort of cyber sovereign model, it proliferates something called internet fragmentation, which basically means that rather than having, one free, open, interoperable, secure internet, we're looking at many, many different sort of interconnected intranets, where the Chinese internet is different from the Pakistan internet, is different from the Brazil internet, EU, whatever, and so forth. So really quite concerning. And we've seen particularly how, this cyber sovereignty model or norm has been adopted in other countries in the region.
What Michael lays out is a crucial reminder. Cyber sovereignty isn't just a legal concept. It's a political strategy. By framing internet control as a sovereign right, authoritarian governments justify surveillance, censorship, and the suppression of dissent. But in a globally connected digital world, these domestic policies don't just stay domestic for long. The ripple effects are already being felt across the Indo-Pacific, challenging the opening internet as we know it. And the second norm, multilateralism. But not in the way you might expect.
This is concerning because we really need to unpack, right? What does it mean when China talks about multilateralism? And I think sometimes, unfortunately, stakeholders, lawmakers, international decision makers, and in particular right now as we see sort of, the withdrawal of the US from the international space, creating a vacuum, China talking about multilateralism, some might be inclined to say, oh, well, this is an embrace of multipolarity and equality among nations, but it's not. When China talks about multilateralism, and of course this doesn't just apply to the digital governance space, but it's talking about, one, the exploitation of existing multilateral fora, and we've seen this and it's been documented a lot, how China has sort of taken control of the Human Rights Council or some of the other existing UN agencies or multilateral bodies to push its agenda and its influence, contrary to international rights, norms, and others. The second thing that it means when China talks about promoting multilateralism is the creation of its own contrasting, conflicting multilateral fora. And this is things like the World Internet Conference that the Cyberspace Administration of China hosts in Wuzhen. This is like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or others. And so the purpose of these contrasting multilateral fora is that China says, oh, look, we are about promoting multilateralism, but they're really trying to carve out not just a space for their more authoritarian influence and direction within the existing multilateral fora, but to also create contrasting and competing multilateral fora that eventually will supplant the existing fora that exist and have been created over the last 80 years. But the third that's really of concern, and I think that doesn't get as much attention, again, is that when China talks about promoting multilateralism in digital governance and cybersecurity and obviously in a range of other domains, they're talking about contrasting that with multi-stakeholderism, denying multi-stakeholderism, which is a prevailing international best practice around internet governance, collaboration and sort of cooperation between different stakeholders. So whereas multilateralism tends to be about coordination and communication between states, multi-stakeholderism is, yes, there's a place obviously for sovereign nation states, but also a key role for civil society, the private sector, the tech sector, academia, and other stakeholder groups. And the reason why multi-stakeholderism is so important is, again, because it tends to be more inclusive, more collaborative, more transparent. And so by hollowing out and attacking multi-stakeholderism as the prevailing sort of norm, by pushing this interpretation or this embrace of multilateralism, again, we really see how China is pushing this state-driven, anti-human rights, anti-inclusive, anti-civil society approach.
China's version of multilateralism isn't about inclusion, it is about control. By sidelining civil society and replacing open collaborative models with state-only dialogue, Beijing is reshaping the rules of global internet governance. It's not just exploiting international institutions, it's building its own to rival them. And in doing so, it's steadily eroding the multi-stakeholder system that has kept the internet open, participatory, and most importantly, accountable. And finally, here comes securitization, the idea that building digital infrastructure should serve state control first, and human rights second.
The securitization of digital development, it's really about tying development and security as two sides of the same coin. And of course, there are security considerations to be taken into development. The concern here is really that by securitizing digital development, again, what we tend to see is an approach that sees developing digital infrastructure, developing information communication technologies as really part of the centralizing control of the state, so that we find that there's an embrace of laws and policies that are more about narratives of national security or the securitization of state interests over the rights of individuals through human rights safeguards, protection, transparency, and things like this. And so really by securitizing digital development, we see that it carves out or it denies a place for the type of transparency or human rights by design that we would argue is necessary for everything from the infrastructure, the tools, the technologies, and of course the laws that govern that infrastructure.
When infrastructure is built around the logic of national security, rights become negotiable. What China is exporting isn't just fiber optic cables or 5G towers. It's a governance model where development serves surveillance, and connectivity comes with strings attached. This is what securitization of digital development looks like, a framework where control trumps transparency and state power overrides individual freedoms. All these norms with Chinese characteristics sound terrifying to an internet user like me. But China isn't promoting these norms for free. There are clear benefits.
Well, I think there's a few ways. One would be in the sort of symbolic way in which it normalizes China's authoritarian governance approach. As countries adopt similar laws, policies, institutions take on the form, learning from, CAC and others, or adopting these types of norms. We've seen a lot of explicit reference to cyber sovereignty from Vietnam, for example, and others around the world. It normalizes what China is doing. It makes it harder for the international community to raise human rights critiques, to challenge China. And of course, then it means it's harder to hold it accountable. It's harder to hold it as a state actor accountable for abuses domestically and internationally if those abuses have been normalized as part of a new international normative approach, whether it's through technical standards, international conventions, international law, or just sort of normalized governance practices. So I think one is certainly within that regard. And the other then too is from an economic perspective. As China promotes these types of norms or standards, oftentimes this would then also come along with more technical standards or protocols that the Chinese technology companies who are, say, part of developing out infrastructure or data centers or what have you, so when Huawei or ZTE are heavily involved in developing out some of the digital infrastructure in Indonesia or Cambodia or other parts of the world, they're doing so under the same regulatory understanding that China is pushing, with the same tools, technologies, and protocols for how those technologies interact with other technologies. And again, so as the sort of China model from the, say, physical layer to the governance layer is promoted, again, it means that it shrinks the space for conflicting providers. So firstly, then, shrinking the space for conflicting sort of normative or governance providers, and then obviously shrinking the space for the actual technology providers, which is then obviously also promoting sort of economic, priorities of the state.
What China is exporting isn't just a digital infrastructure. It's a vision of how the internet should be controlled, who gets to shape it, and whose values define its future. And as that vision spreads, it crowds out competing models, ones grounded in transparency, human rights, and open participation. And the stakes aren't just regional, they're global. Thank you for listening. My name is Iris Xu. This episode of The Divide is produced by Radio Taiwan International.